Hey, I think I'm live. I see a list of people in here with me right now. See a few names I recognize, like Jeff and Lucy. Hey guys, hope you guys are doing well. Before I get started, as usual, if you can do me a favor, if you can hear and see me okay and see my screen that says Mastering Tricky Exposures, just chime in. I think you can chime in on either the chat or the Q&A on your screen, and that way I know that everyone can hear me good and we can get this thing started. Because sometimes you never know, because I'm in my office right now and I'm talking to myself, and I never know if people can hear me or not. So again, if you can hear me, let me know. I can see you guys that are in here. Okay. All right. Looks like at least Jeff and Curtis can see and hear me. So I'm assuming everyone else can as well. See that Dale's in here. Hey Dale, I hope you're doing well. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Hey, welcome everybody. Okay, Shanda, good to see you here too. She says chat's disabled, so I didn't know that. So if you have any questions as I go along today, just type it into the Q&A, and I'm monitoring that as we go. I usually like answering questions as I go anyway, instead of waiting until the very end. So if you have any questions as we go through this presentation, let me know. I'm as you know, if you've watched many of these webinars before, I am an advocate of making this as much of a dialogue as I can, not necessarily a monologue. And so that's why I don't mind stopping what I'm talking about during the presentation, answering questions, having a little bit of feedback and a little bit of give and take as we go along this thing. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the world headquarters of russellgraves.com. I'm coming to you live from Dodge City, Texas. It's 12:01 Texas time, and so it's been a while since I've been here, and it's good to see some of you guys back in here. Good to see all you guys back in here, but the ones that I've met in person, it's good to see you guys as well. It's been a pretty busy summer so far. I think the last webinar I did was back in June sometime. I'm pretty sure I didn't do any in July, but July was super busy. We were out on the Alaska Uncharted trip where we camped. I was out there 2 weeks. Me and Russ Nordstrand and Trevor LeClaire were out there for 2 weeks. A new guide, Grant, he was out there with us for about half the time. But anyway, we had a great time out there. Had a lot of good guests, a lot of good opportunities rolled through that camp. And man, you want to talk about an adventure. It was an adventurous time out there. Weather was what I expected the weather to be. We had about a third of the time the weather was overcast and the temperatures were perfect. Had about a third of the time the temperatures were way too hot, and about a third of the time it rained on us. So that's the kind of thing you have to deal with, especially when you're in Alaska. And then got back from that, was pretty busy with some family vacations and having to travel downstate and work on some things. And then last week I was actually back in Alaska. Covered on a trip that I wasn't expected to go on, but the good folks at Backcountry Journeys needed a little bit of help, and anytime I get a chance to go back to Alaska, I took advantage of it. So we had a great trip last week as well. And not just me having great trips, it's really everybody. You know, I've been talking to Ben Blankenship. He's been telling me about some of his trips and the good times that he had. Who else? Matt Meisenheimer, Kenton Kruger, really the whole gang that I've been staying in contact with over the past month or month and a half. They've had a good time. If you were scheduled to be on the wildlife photo critique that I was supposed to do last week, again, the reason why I didn't get to do it is because I was in Alaska. I covered that trip kind of on a last minute basis up there. And so we're going to reschedule that wildlife photography critique seminar or webinar. And so just be on the lookout for that. I'm not sure exactly what day it is, but I know I've got a busy schedule coming up. I've got webinars a lot this month. I've kind of take a little bit of a hiatus next month because I'll be back in the field again, but coming up for the rest of the year, I love doing these webinars. Glad you guys are here with me. And if you've never heard me say this before, I'll say it right now. You're looking at the entire photography enthusiast community of Dodge City, Texas. And anytime I get a chance to talk photography with a lot of like-minded people, I'll always take advantage of that. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about mastering tricky exposures. You know, really, as I think back to the I'm 51 now. I started taking pictures when I was probably 16 or 17. I mean, taking pictures in earnest, really enthusiastically, and trying to learn the craft. So I'm not very good at math. So how many years is that? 30, 32, 30, 34 years, I think. I've been taking pictures, pressing a button on the camera and seeing what happens. And like a lot of people, the exposure part was a little bit tricky in the beginning. And it took a while for me to think about the process and think about what I was trying to do. And I can tell you, when I finally figured it out, how to master exposure and really to try to make my camera match what I was seeing in the field, it made all the difference in the world in my photography. It's one of those things that you hear professional athletes talk about when they get to that point in their career, like especially NFL quarterbacks, when they get to that point in the career where the game kind of slows down for them. And all of a sudden, everything else becomes clear and it makes more sense what they need to do. For me, understanding exposure and finally getting to that point was that point in my career and what I was able to do with the camera. Once I understand how the camera saw the world, and then understood in my mind how to overcome that in a lot of cases and be able to manipulate my camera and set my camera accordingly, then it made all the difference in the world. Between that and using a tripod, and you guys heard me talk a lot about that, those two things really made the most difference in my ability to go from being a student of the game to not being a master. I never consider myself a master, but being a student of the game to one who really, instead of the game controlling me, I started being able to control the game. And so it made all the difference in the world. And I'm going to talk to you about a few really simple and kind of common sense ways, actually, to really nail exposure in the field and sort of tell you how cameras think and what situations you're liable to arise in the field. It's hard to be real specific on a webinar like this because tricky exposures is it's kind of a confusing term because really all exposures can be tricky. But I'm going to talk in generalities here, and so if you have any comments or questions as I go through, feel free to ask them. Again, Mastering Tricky Exposures. My name is Russell Graves, and oops, I hit the wrong button as I often do. Here we go. And so one of the things that I've learned early on when I'm taking pictures in the field is just, and this is back in my film days when for the first, I'm going to say I started taking pictures in 1987. And so from 1987 till about 2004 and 5, when I finally made the switch to digital, what is that? 87, 97. So 97 to 05. So 18 years, almost 20 years, almost half the time I've shot, or I guess more than half the time I've shot pictures. I shot on film. And when you're a young photographer like I was, you had to get it right because, if you ever used film before, there's no latitude mistakes, and you get 36 shots per roll, and each one of those pictures costs you money. And so early on in my 20s, that's when I started trying to figure out, I didn't want to make as many mistakes because one, it costs $12 per roll for film and processing to make mistakes. And so every time I pressed a button, you could feel the sting of the financial sting of that action every time you'd press a button. So I learned early on to really try to get it as close as I could to right in the camera. And so that one sensibility I still carry on today, even with digital, where you have a lot more latitude to get it wrong and be able to fix it in post-processing. I still try to get it right. I was talking to the group we had on the Kenai Peninsula trip last week. I was giving them a little bit of classroom instruction, and I was illustrating to them why I always try to get it right in the camera. And essentially what it does, it saves me time on the back end. The less time, from my standpoint, the less time I can sit in front of my computer in my office and work on pictures, the better off I am. I live in the country. I've got a farm. I got plenty of stuff to do on the farm, and I got plenty of animals to see and photograph on this place. And so my time, I'd rather spend it outdoors, whether working on something on the farm or whether trying to take pictures of something. Right now, the hummingbirds are everywhere outside. I bet I saw 20 around 1 feeder this morning. So I'm trying to figure out how to get pictures of those today. So the less time I can spend behind the computer, the better. So getting it right and understanding how to master tricky exposures not only will help you in the field, it's also going to help you spend time taking more pictures in the field instead of working on everything on the computer. And so in a way, these pictures you see here, the pronghorn antelope on the left, there's a little bit of trickiness about that one. The silhouette of the bison on the right, or the bleeding heart flowers I took in the Smoky Mountains on a Smoky Mountain trip in the upper right. They've all got different ways that you can kind of think about it. And I'll try to simplify that process as we go through this. But the trick is understanding how cameras behave. And usually this is whether it's Sony, Nikon, Olympus, Canon. Cameras usually behave like cameras because there's a standardized way that they see the world. And then you can read it here. This is my quote, by the way. Camera meters they're calibrated to see the world as 18% gray. And as such, they don't always see a scene correctly, especially when you're talking about in the outdoors, because the outdoors are all 18% gray. If you think about the histogram on the back of your camera, and I should have put a diagram on it from this, but I think people know the histogram good enough where I can explain it. If you look at the histogram on your camera, the left side of the histogram is pure white. The right side of the histogram is pure black. And then in the middle, right in the middle, is 18% gray. And that's just how camera meters are calibrated. You know, back when camera meters were simple, they were calibrated that way. And even now they're more complicated. And they've got the algorithms that they can use to try to calculate precise exposure based on the scene. Even though they're becoming better and better and better, essentially they're still calculated on the old standard 18% gray, or what's that middle tone that we can see with our vision. Not purely black, not purely white, but something that's right in the middle. And that's how they're calibrated. And so anytime that you're in the outdoors and the camera is telling you what the exposure ought to be based on your ISO and based on your aperture and your shutter speed, what that total exposure ought to be, it's basing that on the assumption it's trying to make everything 18% gray. And then so when you know that, you realize that every time you look through a camera at a scene, the camera is going to expose the scene in one of three ways. And it's only three ways that can happen. And once you start thinking about it like this, you realize that this is the part when I realized in my mind that the game got slower, as I mentioned earlier. Before I go any further, well, I'll go back to this picture, but your camera is going to look at a scene and expose it one of three ways. And then what you need to understand, and this is really the key, is starting to get that muscle memory or starting to understand and see those scenes. When you see a particular scene, you understand what the camera is going to do. For example, if there's a bright background, the camera will tend to underexpose the picture. And we've all done it before. I've done it a billion times in my life. You take a picture of something in the snow, and instead of the snow looking white, it's going to look, and if we were in person, everybody would get this answer right. The snow is going to look gray. And the reason why it's going to look gray is because the camera sees all that white and tries to expose everything that's calibrated 18% gray. And therefore, the snow ends up looking gray. And so you got to understand that if it's got a bright background, and that background may be snow or it may be a bright sky, the camera is always going to tend to underexpose. The next scenario is camera is going to tend to overexpose. And so conversely, if it's a dark background, let me back up. See, bright backgrounds cause cameras to tend to underexpose. Dark backgrounds tend to make cameras overexpose. So in other words, if a camera saw this dark background behind this mule deer buck, it would try to make it 18% gray. And instead of the background going dark like you can see with your eyes or like your artistic vision sees, instead of the background being dark, it's going to be kind of a grayish color. It's going to try to add light to that background the camera is. And so it's important that you understand how that works. And it's counterintuitive. And I think that was on purpose for camera manufacturers, because everything kind of works backwards the way you try to describe stuff. But I'll go back through this again. Again, there's three ways the camera is going to expose a scene. And the best thing you can do is understand what those scenes are. Bright background is going to underexpose. Dark background is going to tend to overexpose, or it's going to make the scene too bright. And if the middle tone dominates, like in this scene of these mule deer bucks fighting, if the middle tone dominates, if there's nothing really dark or really bright in the photo, camera's usually going to get it right. So those are the three ways the camera is always going to respond to a scene. It's going to overexpose, underexpose, or get the correct exposure. And one of the things I found that's helped me, my nose is itching, by the way. One of the things I found that helps me is being able to look at a scene and at least approximate. Now, I can't look at a scene and tell you, oh, this is going to be 1/500th of a second at f8 and shooting at ISO 400. I can get it close, but I can't tell you exactly what it's going to be. But I can look at a scene and tell you whether or not the camera is going to overexpose, underexpose, or likely get the correct exposure. And just by understanding those three things and those three scenarios, it helps me set that camera in the end to be able to nail the exposure the first time, almost every time. What I was going to tell you is here's a couple of scenes here that this picture of this pronghorn buck, it was standing where it was standing was in pretty open shade. It was a little bit of sunlight coming through, but not perfectly. But you can see back behind it was really shaded. And so for that buck to stand out against that background, if I'd have let the camera decide, since it's got a dark background and the dark background tends to dominate the image, the camera would have probably overexposed this image a little bit instead of having a super sharp, well-exposed mule deer buck. I mean, a pronghorn antelope buck. The whites in this buck would have been blown out and the exposure would have just been off because the camera would have tried to overexpose the picture. Same with this this egret. If it's a white subject on a dark background, if the camera would have decided, it would have tried to make the white not so much white and the dark not so much, or the blacks not so much black. It have made everything kind of right in the middle, 18% gray. And so just by understanding that, I was able to set the camera accordingly. And I'm setting it based off looking at the meter inside my camera. The camera is going to tell you one thing, and this is the thing where you got to trust your instincts. A lot of times in these situations like that, the camera is going to be telling you what the correct exposure to put. But when you dial your own exposure in, it's going to tell you you're wrong, but you just got to trust your instincts and go with it. And again, after a while, all this becomes muscle memory, and you get where you can just do this in your head without even thinking about it. And so again, the three things, and I need to reiterate that again because it's so important. The three things that a camera is going to see every scene is going to do one of three things: overexpose the picture, underexpose the picture, or get the correct exposure. Typically, the under or overexposure isn't a lot. It's not real extreme. It's usually by a stop or two, but it's still going to do that, especially in some of these scenes right here where you've got a dark background or a bright background. And so for me in this fox picture, just to talk about these pictures a little bit, it was important for me to have a correctly exposed fox, and I wanted that snow to look really, really white. So I really wanted to almost kind of a high-key studio sort of look. And by the way, this picture hasn't been worked on anyway in the computer. I actually pointed the camera at that fox, made my appropriate adjustments that I needed to make to get the correct exposure, and took the picture like you see it right there. And so that fox is actually standing against a snowbank because the fox is correctly exposed. It made the snow a little bit overexposed, but it shows up as white. And so to do that, it's just, again, trying to outthink your camera and dial in those exposures that you know to be correct and not necessarily what the camera says is correct. Same way with this one. I ran across this mule deer buck early one morning. It was standing across a shaded thicket of trees. And as the sun was kind of coming over the left side of those trees, you can see it was putting that rim light on it and really backlighting the breath as he would breathe out through his nose. And to get all of that detail in the shots, that rim light around the ear or the whiskers around his muzzle, and just the breath as it's coming out. If the camera would have decided those highlight areas, the whiskers, the breath, the rim light around the ears and the antlers, all that would have been really, really blown out, and you'd have lost detail if you let the camera decide. Glenn asked the question: do you use spot metering on these or use exposure compensation? I'm getting to that one, Glenn. So I'll answer that question in just a minute. But that's a great question, by the way. And then again, if the middle tone dominates, if there's nothing really dark or really black, the cameras generally do a pretty good job of it. But if you've been in nature much, you know that mid-tones don't always exist everywhere, especially where animals are liable to be. So you've got to learn how to work with those extremes when the camera's going to get it wrong. Here's a few more examples. Picture on the left of the white-tailed buck standing in the grass. Middle tone all the way. All I did was point the camera at it. if you've watched some of my webinars before, 80% of the time, and that's verifiable by data that I showed y'all, 80% of the time I take pictures, I use Aperture Priority because I like this time-saving aspects of Aperture Priority, and I like to be able to control the aperture and let the aperture stay static, and also control the ISO and let the ISO stay static. So that way the camera is making decisions on shutter speed based on the scene. So I can tell you that picture right there is it is the picture on the left. That was just simple mid-tone. Camera gets it right every time. On the upper right, the picture of the turkey gobbling there, that shot actually is one of the ones that cameras can't get right. It's a dark turkey against a dark background, and all you see, if you look, that shaft of light is coming from left to right to illuminate the turkey. And because of that, the camera can't get it right. So at that point, I've got to dial in compensation to try to figure out how to get the correct exposure on that. Or on the lower right, the fall leaves in the cabin there in Cades Cove in the Smoky Mountain National Park in the fall. That shot there, it's pretty well mid-tone. You had to use a little, I think I had to use a little bit of exposure adjustment to fix that. And so the question arrives is, how do you arrive at correct exposure? And it's really simpler than you think. And I'm going to go through these kind of bullet point at a time with some different strategies that you can use, but I'll go through and talk about each one of them in a little more detail individually. One way is you can use the Sunny F16 rule. If you've never heard of that, it's an old film rule. I'll explain a little more in a minute. You can look for the middle tone in your subject. You can use exposure compensation for the aperture priority, and I should have put shutter priority modes, but I'm so stuck on aperture priority, that's what I thought about. Or you can use manual mode. And so again, and Glenn, I've kind of alluded to it already. I use exposure compensation. I hardly ever change my metering mode on my camera. I use the value to metering on Canons. I could change the spot metering, but I've gotten now where I can kind of predict what the camera is going to do and don't really need to use spot metering. But spot metering is definitely an option you can use. And the reason why I don't change it that much, because I always forget to change stuff back. If you've ever been on one of these photo tours with me, and if you've ever listened to the webinar a lot, you'll understand. First of all, you'll be completely underwhelmed by the camera equipment I use, because I don't use the latest and greatest. In fact, my newest camera body is a Canon 90D. I bought mainly for its 4K video capabilities, but my newest kind of pro body I've got is the 1D Mark IV that was probably made 6 or 8 years ago. It's just not a new camera, but it works good. I know how to use it. And so the big reason why I don't, so the biggest reason I don't use spot metering is because I like to keep my settings streamlined and as simple as possible, particularly when I'm shooting pictures of wildlife, because stuff is so dynamic when it happens, like this elk bugling here. And so typically, if I had it set for spot metering on another one and I don't need it for the next one and I don't forget to change it, I might throw the exposure off. So I've just gotten where I can spot these scenarios good and be able to dial it in pretty close before I even shoot the picture. And then Nick had a question. Speaking of ISO, would you sacrifice noise to get the shot? Usually I don't. I mean, and again, this is verifiable. I've got a webinar coming up called using metadata to improve your wildlife or your nature photography. And I was going to share with you then, but I've alluded to it once already. I've got a program I use that I can harvest all the metadata in every picture I've ever taken. I've got a library of about 600,000 images, and I can mine the metadata out of every one and look at them in graphical form. And so I can make pie charts based on the data I use. And that's how I know 80% of the pictures I take are in aperture priority. And I can also tell you probably 80% of the pictures I take, Nick, are between 400 and 800 ISO. And so I usually don't sacrifice. I guess if I saw a Bigfoot and I really needed to push it, I could, but I'm kind of an old school advocate of proper technique, and proper technique includes using a tripod or using some kind of brace whenever you can. And usually shooting at ISO 800 with proper technique, you can shoot till the sun goes down with the equipment I use. And so I've had real good success there. And so I guess technically if I had to sacrifice noise, I would, but I really try not to, because in the end, my sensibilities are all based around one simple fact. Even though I do these backcountry journey tours and do the educational part of being a professional photographer, most of my bread and butter comes from I shoot for a lot of magazines, and I shoot for a lot of commercial clients, and I do ad campaigns for all these commercial clients, or I shoot magazine assignments for these clients. And so for them, the image matters, and being able to get as clean an image as I can on the page or on whatever their packaging or whatever else that image is going to be used for is important to me. And so my sensibilities are all based around trying to shoot as low ISO as I can, using proper techniques, so that way my days can be expanded in terms of how early or how late I can shoot, and just being mindful of the simple fundamental rules of photography. And again, I've had pretty good luck doing that. Okay, let's talk about the Sunny 16 rule just a little bit. And that's an old film rule, but it still works even with digital cameras. And the Sunny 16 rule, if you've never heard of it, says that in full sunlight, if you set your aperture at f16, the correct shutter speed should be the number closest to the ISO speed you've got dialed in. So in other words, here's an example. On a sunny day, like if I walked outside right now without even looking at my meter, I could set my camera based on the ISO. So if I shoot at ISO 400 and I set my camera at f16, the correct shutter speed should be 1/500th of a second. And you may be thinking, well, what if I don't really want to shoot at f16? How can I change that? Well, that number is scalable. So all of a sudden, if you start moving your aperture in one stop increments, if you go from f16 to f11, then you change the shutter speed. If you remember the exposure triangle, you change the shutter speed from 1/500th of a second. It's one full stop to 1/1000th of a second. And then you go f16 to f8. It goes from 1/1000th of a second to 1/2000th of a second. So you match that change in your aperture with the change in shutter speed, and the exposure will stay the same. I use this rule a lot, especially one of my favorite things to take pictures of are turkeys. And I can tell you, let me get back up. That picture of that wild turkey right there, I arrived at correct exposure based on using that Sunny 16 rule in my head. And sometimes I'll just, if I'm not using it in my head, you can buy apps that have calculators that will show you, okay, it's sunny outside. If I'm shooting at ISO 400 and shooting at f5.6, what should my shutter speed be based on the Sunny f16 rule? And that's exactly the way I got the exposure in that turkey picture right there, because that's a tough exposure and the cameras can't always get it right. But understanding that Sunny 16 rule is a tried and true method, and it's an old rule, and I believe it was developed before the meters were even developed. And when that was developed, this is what it said. I mean, it said according to your shutter speed should be the ISO, the speed closest to the ISO you're using, and at f16. I'm sorry, someone just walked in my house and I wasn't sure who it was, so that got me kind of derailed a little bit. So I apologize for the stumbling there. But again, this is how it works. If you're shooting at f16, the correct exposure on a sunny day should be f16, and if you're shooting ISO 400, the shutter speed that's closest to that. If you're shooting at ISO 1000, then at f16 on a sunny day, your shutter speed should be 1000, and from there you can back it off. Cheryl asked, does the ISO remain at 400? Okay, so I'm looking at your question, Cheryl. If you said, so in the example I used, and again, you can buy an app as a calculator. Just, I think if you look on one of the app stores, I looked it up not long ago. It's just a Sunny 16 calculator. I know you can find those calculators online if you look at it. But again, the rule says that f16, your shutter speed should be closest to the ISO that you're using. So that ISO can be anything. If you're shooting at 100 ISO and then at f16 and sunny, when it's sunny, the closest shutter speed you should use is 1/25th of a second. It's whatever the shutter speed's closest to the ISO at f16 will get you there. And so what I do is in my head or on paper or using one of those apps, you can start backing it off to say, according to the Sunny 16 rule, if I don't want to shoot at ISO, if I don't want to shoot at f16 and I dial it to f5.6 at a particular ISO, what should my shutter speed do? And it will calculate that for you immediately. And if I hope that makes sense how I explained it. But if not, again, I encourage you to go online, look up the Sunny 16 rule, look a Sunny 16 rule calculator, and you can see how one influences the other one. But I'll double down on this. I'll go back again. That turkey picture right there, that's exactly how I would establish exposures, correct exposures on turkey, because the camera would see that and it wouldn't be able to figure out what to do with a dark background and a bird that looks black to the eye but has all the iridescence. And so I told the camera, I don't care what you're telling me to do. I know better. I'm going to dial this in based on that tried and true Sunny 16 method, and you'll get the correct exposure every time. Let me get back to where we were. And so a coyote on grass like that, that's a mid-tone subject. Camera will always get that right. And so with that said, another thing I do is look for the middle tone in the subject. And back to Glenn's question, this is where spot metering, if you can remember to change it back, is helpful as well. But always look for the middle tone in the subject. And the middle tone is that color between pure black and pure white. And so I'm always trying to figure out what's the closest approximation to middle tone. Hang on one second. What's the closest approximation of middle tone that I can find? Well, it just so happens is we have perfect middle tone that's around us all the time. If you look at the northern sky about 25 degrees up from the horizon, that is almost perfectly 18% gray in its tone. It's halfway between black and white. And on blue sky days, I'll do that a lot. I'm trying to figure out an exposure. Either it's got a bright background or a dark background. And if I'm trying to get in the ballpark, my exposure needs to be, I can point my camera at the middle, at the northern sky, 25% up, and whatever the camera recommends it be set at to expose the sky properly, that exposure is going to be exactly the same as what I'm looking at there. Because really all I'm trying to do is, like in a picture, again, to go back to the bear or to the turkey or a lot of these pictures you're seeing, I'm not worried about how the background looks. All I'm worried about is that animal going to be correctly exposed. And the same light that's falling on the northern sky at 25 degrees up is the same light typically that's going to be falling on your subject that you're trying to take a picture of. And so in that case, a lot of times I'll point at the northern sky, either dial in the exposure manually or use that AE button that's on these cameras and lock in the exposure and then recompose and shoot. And then Stephen asked the question, someone else asked the question that disappeared from here. I'm not sure what happened to it, but Stephen asked the question, what about camera lens shake due to zoom length? That's where I'm an advocate of using a tripod or some other kind of good solid support, Stephen. You can take a lot of that out and shoot at really slow shutter speeds and eliminate that camera shake. And I've talked about this before. I did it a few months ago on a webinar. I talked about how really with all the new technology, fundamentals seem to be getting lost a little bit. And so if you think about the most iconic pictures you can think of that have been taken in nature, a lot of people come to the same two shots. Snake River Overlook by Ansel Adams, which was taken on a camera without a meter and shot on film. And then the picture that Tom Mangelson took at Brooks Falls of the fish jumping into the bear's mouth. And that was taken in 1988 with a little more modern cameras, but still shot on film. But the one thing all those iconic pictures have in common is they used a good sound set of photographic fundamentals to acquire that image. They got the exposure correct. They used the tripod. They did all of those fundamental things correctly in order to put themselves in a position to be able to control that shot. And so I advocate that as well. It seems like now with the in-body camera stabilization or the lens stabilization that people cheat on that a little bit. Carrying a tripod or a monopod or using some kind of support is not all that handy at all. I'll be the first to admit. But if you take the time to do it and take the time to learn to use it, that's one of those things that'll make an instant difference in the quality of your photography. I know it did mine. This right here is a good example. Now, this is me talking. You may be able to, but if you could zoom in on that pronghorn shot right there and see just how incredibly sharp that picture is, and that's with no sharpening. I don't sharpen the images out of the computer. That's with no sharpening, but that thing is laser sharp. You can see the hairs on his back, is how much detail is in that shot. And the one secret I used a tripod. And that way that lens I used to shoot that picture with was steady. And so again, I can talk all day long about using sound fundamentals. It's just the same as in when we're talking sports. You know, you can if any of the pro golfers that play golf, if they didn't have, I mean, any pro golfer could take the worst set of clubs and still go beat me at golf, because it's not about the clubs. It's not about the equipment they're using. It's about how fundamentally sound they are. And that's the same way with photography. It doesn't matter how good your technology gets. If you've still got substandard fundamentals, your pictures are going to show it. And that's just a fact. And so I hope that answers your question, Stephen. I went a little long-winded about it. Oops. Okay, back to the presentation. Again, look for the middle tone, and the middle tone may be just the grass behind that coyote, or it may be the body of this elk is more in the mid tones. The background is dark, the head of it's dark, but the elk's body is more of a mid tone. And so I look for the mid tone in the subject and try to figure off that. So in this picture right here of the Teton Range reflected at Schwabacher's Landing, you know, you got a lot of things here that the camera is going to probably screw up the exposure. You got the dark trees, reflected in the water. You got the water that's a little bit dark, but really all I care about really is how the lights look on the mountain, because the mountains are the star of the subject. If everything else, the trees go dark, that's fine, but the mountains are the star of the subject. You can always shoot something like that in HDR, but to acquire proper exposure on that, I pointed the camera at the sky, because the sky is in full sunlight, just like the mountaintops, exposed for what the camera told me, recomposed, and shot the picture, and that's how it came out. And this is what I do most of the time, use exposure compensation. I found this really, really handy. In exposure compensation, if you don't know, if you look on your camera, you'll see a plus and a minus button somewhere. And that plus and minus button is what helps you dial in exposure compensation if you're using one of the modes on your camera, like aperture or shutter priority. I hardly ever use shutter priority, but aperture priority and exposure compensation really, really works well for me. On Canons, they don't necessarily have a plus and minus button, but I know a lot of the Sonys I've seen have the dial on the, I believe it's on the right side of the camera, that have the plus and minus, and that's exposure compensation. On my Canon cameras I use, it's got a wheel on the back that you turn. I know on Nikons, they've actually got a button that you've got to push to be able to dial in exposure compensation. But exposure compensation has to do with that plus and minus button. And what it allows you to do is the camera will make the suggestion on the shutter, but it allows you to override that to some degree. And so here's how it works in my mind every single time. And again, I'm an advocate of keeping things simple. Number one, you take a picture. Step two, you look at the back of the camera. If the picture looks dark, or if the camera has underexposed it, you need to add light or move the exposure compensation to the plus side. So in other words, if it looks dark, you got to add light to the image. So you got a plus light, or you have to add light to the image, and the universal symbol for addition is the plus sign. So if you got to add light, you got a plus light, or add light into the picture, use plus exposure compensation. Step three, if the picture looks too bright, you need to subtract the light from it or go the opposite way. Jeff says he uses it on his Olympus all the time. I've seen your pictures on the Tribe, Jeff, and I know you've got that mastered. So I use it all the time as well. And that's really by using exposure compensation, by using the aperture priority and exposure compensation, I can get exposures dialed in within half a second. It takes no time for me to do it. And again, a lot of it's muscle memory. You just got to think about what to do and know what to do before you have to do it. But it just allows me to really respond to the situation around me, and really allows me to respond quickly. But that's what you got to get in your head. You take the picture and look at it. If the picture looks too bright, you got to take light away or minus. If it looks too dark, you got to add light or plus exposure compensation. And it's really that simple. That sounds really simple to do. And of all the things I've taught in these workshops, when I teach people how to do that, that's the one thing they'll come back and tell me that how much difference it made in their ability to take pictures and get exposures correctly. So exposure compensation is not something I learned on initially. It's something I've been using for the past 10 years or so, but I've found it to be really, really, really helpful. And by the way, if you don't, or two things actually, by the way, if the picture looks fine on the back of your camera, then you don't have to dial any exposure compensation in. Now, here's the trick usually, and this is what helps speed things up in the process. On these cameras, you've got +1, +2, +3, and you may be thinking, okay, how far do I go in either way? Well, here's the good news. I found out that the meters do a pretty good job, and because they do such a good job, it's usually just doing as far as +1 or -1 on exposure compensation and not really ever having to go much further than that. So it's not like instead of having, if each stop is in third stop increments 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. So instead of having 18 choices from which to choose on where to set the exposure compensation, I can eliminate that down to 6 because it's usually not any more than +1 or not any less than -1 on exposure compensation. And then, of course, the one option you can always do is use manual mode. You know, when I first started getting exposure figured out, that's what I almost exclusively used as manual mode, because there it's you can just dial it in and not have to worry about resetting your camera. You just got to remember to change the mode each time you shoot the picture. But manual mode is a good learning tool to use. Oops, hang on, let me go back too far. And then on manual mode, you can just set your exposure based on how this image looks or how the scenes looks, and then not have to worry about what your camera meter tells you. So Craig has a question here. Using a white egret example, why is exposure compensation better than spot metering when trying not to overexpose the egret? It's not better, Craig. That's the beautiful thing about photography. There's a million different ways to skin a cat. It's not better. It's just a different way. It's just the way I use, because it's just what I can use to achieve the goals I'm trying to get even quicker. I'll back up to that spot so we can reference the picture we're talking about, like that one right there. You could use spot metering, but well, and this is me, you can probably do it better than I can. But while I'm looking at my camera trying to switch it from evaluative metering over to spot metering, that bird is doing that right there, and I'm missing those shots. So I'd rather just keep my camera set the same all the time. Evaluative metering, aperture priority. I'm controlling my ISO. I'm controlling my aperture. The camera is going to decide the shutter speed, and all I'm doing is overriding what the camera says just by moving my thumb a couple of clicks in either direction and dialing in the exposure compensation. And so that's why I like using exposure compensation better. It just gives me less things to worry about and less things to have to move and change later on. But like I said, Craig, there's a million ways to skin a cat, and that's the way I'm explaining, just my way I do it. You could actually use spot metering. So Jeff says, correct me if I'm wrong, but on something like the egret image, I'm assuming that you're using a negative number if using exposure compensation to expose that image correctly. Yeah, I am, because if the camera decided the camera would be biased for all the dark around in the water and on the background. And so the camera would actually try to make it too light. So if the image is too light and you have to take light away, you got to use minus exposure compensation. So yeah, I did the minus exposure compensation on that to make the shadows look like they need to look. And when I exposed for this, and when that came out right, when the background areas came out right, by default, the bird's going to come out right. Okay, so Linda said, and I'll go back to this. Thanks for these questions, by the way, because I don't always want to assume that I am speaking clearly. and explaining things clearly. So I appreciate these questions. I'm going to get to the part she's talking about. So Linda asked the question, when you're talking about pointing at the sky to get the correct exposure, setting it and then frame the shot, are you using aperture priority to see the exposure and then changing the manual to set the same exposure for the that it gave me in the sky? Most of the time, Linda, what I do is I don't have a camera in here with me. On my camera, I use Canon, and so on Canons they have that little star button on the back, and what that star is the exposure lock. And so I'll frame it, I'll look at the sky, figure out what the midtone subject is, and then use that AE lock to lock in the exposure, or I can even press the button down. Or no, I've got to use AE lock to lock the exposure down, and then I recompose. You can change it all to manual, and it'll do the same thing, but manual is just a few extra steps you need to do. But that AE lock button on your camera will, whatever you're pointing your camera at the time you're metering, once you lock that in, it'll lock it in until you take your finger off the button. So that's usually what I do. And then Jeff says on the Fox image that I showed, is it the same way? So yeah, on this one, the camera would underexpose it. So it would make the snow since the snow is what's going to bias the metering on the camera, it's going to make the image too dark. The cameras are going to tend to underexpose this. So if the image is underexposed or it's too dark, I've got to add light. So instead of doing a minus on exposure compensation, I do a plus. I'm going to add light back to it. So essentially, the camera is going to be thinking it's overexposing the image. And again, all you're doing is compensating for what the camera is getting wrong. Like this, if it's a bright background, it's going to underexpose it. If it's a dark background, it's probably going to overexpose it. And I'm just going to, I don't know if it's going to, all I've got to do is fix it accordingly. A couple of questions came in. Linda said, I don't know if it's me, but you keep freezing, so I'm not hearing or seeing your response. And I don't know if everybody else is seeing that way, but so to answer your question one more time, Linda, if you can hear me, when I'm using when I'm pointing at the northern sky, typically what I'll do is use the AE lock on my camera just to lock that exposure in and recompose. And then Leslie asked, will we have access to a recording of this presentation? Yeah, I don't know how quick it comes out, but usually sometime after it's over, then you get a notification that the recording is available. And so again, as we go through some of these shots and kind of and look at them and really start thinking about them, and that's the key. The key is being out in nature enough to look at the shots and understand what the camera is going to do. With digital, it's really simple that you can experiment. You can frame the shot, look at it, and be able to see how the camera is responding. And if you pay attention, you're going to see some tendencies over after a while. A shot like this, Bobcat on kind of middle tone subject, on sort of mid-tone grass and soft, even lighting, the camera is almost always going to get that right. And then Jeff says, Mark says, when you go back and forth between pictures real quick, you occasionally freeze and then catch back up. Okay, I got you, Mark. I didn't realize it was doing that on that end. I will be mindful of that next time. And so Jeff says he's watched this 2 or 3 times and really just mastering the exposure compensation, but you can do it. And then Mark says, very distracting stalk with the Bobcat. Well, Mark, the way I see it is a Bobcat's so hard to take pictures of in the wild. If there's a distracting stalk in the image, it's not so distracting where you don't look at that Bobcat. So I appreciate your comments, though. It's but that's the way the picture was made, and I'm hesitant to try to even take that out of there because that's just where the Bobcat lives. James says, great presentation. I appreciate that. And You say you'll miss the wildlife image review that got canceled, but we'll pick that back up again, James. I'm not sure where it is. If anybody has any further questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I don't know if we have any more coming in. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that comment. Very well done. But yeah, if you want to stay in touch, or as you think about this, if you have any questions about anything I talked about, feel free to send me an email. There's my email address, russell@russellgraves.com. Something I'm pretty good at is answering emails. I may not always be really, really fast at it, but I always answer emails. I try to, if someone takes the time to send me an email, I'll always take the time to send one back. But again, sometimes I'm in the field and I can't always immediately respond. So if you can be patient with me, I appreciate it. Got some more questions coming in. Not on the subject. Jeff says, not on the subject, but could you talk about back button focus a bit? Do you use back button focus on most of your photographs? Jeff, the truth is I've been experimenting with back button focus. I've tried it in the past and I was never a big fan of it. And again, just because it was trying to learn a new bit of muscle memory than I wasn't used to. And I wasn't a fan of it in the past. And so recently, and I say recently is this summer, I've been trying it again. I'm getting a little more used to it, but I think ultimately I'm not a big fan of it. And I know what I'm saying is completely different than what a lot of people say. But, again, it's not the best way. It's just my way. So I've used it some, not real crazy about it yet, but, I'm trying to learn it and trying to change my mind on that stuff. I got a lot more questions coming in. So if you ask the question, be patient. I'm just kind of going down through them and making sure I get them all answered. Mark asked, polar bear still on for October? The best thing to do on that, Mark, is check with the guys at Backcountry Journeys. I know there was a possibility that because of the resurgence of COVID that might not happen, but I don't have the final answer on that. The best thing I would suggest you do is just contact Kelly or one of the people on the customer service line at Backcountry Journeys and see what they know right now. So as of now, I haven't heard any different. I'm still planning on going. So until that changes, I plan on being on Barter Island in late September, early October. Shanna just says, thanks. Thank you, Shanna. Just let me know if you have any questions. Chuck says, back when I was taking photography classes, the theory was to shoot to the right. Any thoughts? And I'm assuming you mean to the right on the histogram, which would mean to underexpose it a little bit. I think that's probably fair to say, Chuck, if you can. Really, for me, I just try to get it right every time. And so that's when, instead of saying shoot it to the right, I just try to shoot it right every time. And Judith says, thanks. Appreciate you tuning in, Judith. Linda says, thanks, very helpful. I'll be on the Smoky Mountain trip in October. Looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it, Linda. There's not many places more magical than the Southern Hardwoods in October during that time of year. It's just a beautiful, beautiful place. And Glenn says, I'm mostly landscape photography. I'm pretty much mastered, but I appreciate your thoughts on wildlife shots. If you use the back button on your Canon, you lose the exposure lock button. You are correct there. And then Glenn says, doesn't ride overexpose. Maybe so, Glenn. I might have gotten that wrong. So I appreciate you correcting me on that. I'd have to look at my cameras to be sure. That's one of those things that's why I don't, if I try to do too much thinking when I'm taking pictures, I tend to lose shots. So that's why I try to keep my settings pretty simple. Chuck, we'll be on the Smokies trips also. Well, good, Chuck. It'll be good to meet you there. I know we've talked a lot, both on email and through these webinars. So it's going to be a pleasure to meet you when that time comes. And then appreciate it, Bobby. Thanks for your comments. And I think that answers all the questions. If anybody else has any questions for me, just feel free to send them all, and I'll be here as long as y'all want to be here. And if anybody has any questions about any of the pictures I've already shared, you know, I can go back to those as well, and we can hash that out. Hey, I appreciate it, Jeff. You and I, we're gonna. Sorry, I missed you on that last trip. We're gonna get together soon. Okay, Glenn says he uses a 5D Mark IV, and the histogram is 255 right and 0 left. Okay, so I misspoke earlier, Glenn. Sorry about that, and sorry whoever answered. I can't remember who. I think it was Chuck who answered that question. I asked that question, so I said it backwards. Well, I'm looking. I don't see any further questions coming in, but again, I appreciate you guys coming in. Looking at my calendar, I think I might have a webinar. Looks like I got a webinar the next 2 weekends or next 2 weeks of the month. The next webinar is shooting wildlife photos that win contests, or shooting nature photos that win contests, not just wildlife. Believe it or not, I can also shoot landscape pictures, but we've got our own guys within Backcountry Journeys that are pretty good at shooting landscape. And so I'll let those guys do what they do and talk landscape photography more than I do. But I can give you, as someone who's judged a lot of contests, I can give you a tip or two on shooting pictures that'll help you place better in contests. Chuck says, do you have any lens recommendations for the Smokies? On that trip, my lens recommendations are pretty much like they are on almost every trip I go on, is bring your wildlife lens, because the chances of that time of year is of us seeing bears, black bears, white-tailed deer in the rut, and then turkeys and other kind of wildlife are pretty high. So you want to be able to take advantage of that. I always bring a wide-angle lens for shooting the classical landscapes, but then I also should bring a kind of a mid-range lens, a 70 to 200 zoom, because that's also a good landscape lens for up there, particularly if you're wanting to shoot those tight shots of the mountains, kind of that iconic Smoky Mountain shots of the mountains sort of stacked in the distance and with that good smoky look. So that'd be my recommendation there. And that's what I carry almost every trip. I'll carry a 16 to 35 millimeter lens. I'll carry a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, and I've got a 500 millimeter lens that I shoot wildlife with. I'll carry, and in between, or as a supplement to that, I'll carry a 1.4 extender, and I'll also carry extension tubes. And if you don't know extension tubes, it's a cheap way to turn like a 70 to 200 millimeter lens into a macro lens. And so I'll use those in case we see something like a flower or something else pretty close up that intrigues me, that I want to take pictures of. So that's my recommendation there. But yeah, like I said, if you have any other questions beyond this, feel free to send me an email. I always look forward to hearing from people. Look even more forward to it when I get to meet some of you folks in person. It's always fun to get to spend time in the field with you guys and spend time on these webinars with you guys. I know a lot of the guests that have been going on these trips lately have listened in on these webinars, and again, really appreciate it. Hope you find value in what not only I'm doing with these webinars, but also what the other guys at Backcountry Journeys are doing when we bring you these things. And I know they've been a good educational tool for me, just from the standpoint of trying to condense my thoughts and take something that really is second nature for me on some of these photographic techniques and getting to the point where you can explain it to people and it makes sense to them. And so again, I appreciate you guys tuning in and listening to us. And if no one's busy for the next couple of days, come by the place, and we are actually doing some construction work. We're doing some construction on a barn that we've got going up. So if you need something to do, come on to Texas, and I'll put a hammer in your hand. You can help me frame some. So anyway, I'll let you guys go. It doesn't look like we've got any more questions coming in. Really appreciate everything. Appreciate you taking the time to be here, and I will see you next Tuesday. Take care, everybody.